Well, hello, my name's Nicola Thomas. I live in London and I work in London making art. So the work Imitation 3459 is it's a film that I created, and it's using the footage of the 1934 film Imitation of Life and the soundtrack of the 1959 film of Imitation of Life. Well, basically, how it came about was it's a film that I'm very familiar with because my mum loved the film, my grandmother loved the film, so many women of their generation adored this film, and I would watch it a lot whenever they were watching it, and it didn't do anything for me at the time. I just found it very melodramatic and over the top. That's the Douglas Sirk version, the 1959 film, the colour one. And it was about 2 years back, that I caught the film being shown on television. And I saw the scene of Sarah Jane when she's confronted by her mother. Her mother's been searching for her. And basically, Sarah Jane tells her mother to leave her alone. And she says, you know, if you see me out on the street, don't acknowledge me, just pass by like you don't know me whatsoever. And in that moment, it was like I'd seen the film for the first time. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is horrific. It really hit me. And I thought, wow, I'm really kind of reacting to this film on an emotional level, which took me by surprise. And what I found really moving about that scene was the emotion of the mother. Because fair enough, you have Sarah Jane's freaking out. She's shouting at her mother. She's looking at her and telling her, look, you know, I'm white, you know, and all the rest of it. But for me, it was just how her mother was just as hurt, but it was all reined in, and that inner pain. And so I wanted, quite ambitiously, I think, I wanted to try and get across the pain of the mother. And so that's why I focused on the soundtrack, the audio of the mother, and you know, her voice, and trying to get across her pain, and having her words being repeated time and time again, because it's this kind of continual pain that she has in relation to her daughter. So it was that relationship. And I suppose with the work, there's a lot of things that I was trying to cover, because for me, it was all to do with relationships between these two black women, their relationship between each other, how they're viewed within society, how they're viewed differently, that kind of different relationship that they have within society, where the mother just accepts what society dishes out to her, whilst her daughter wants to take a stand and wants to show that her life can be different. And so that's why, for me, that the film had to be a two-channel film to show once again, the relationship between the two women. So you'd have one woman, the mother, being predominantly shown on one screen, the daughter being predominantly shown on another. And the relationship between the audio soundtrack and the visuals. So there was that, and obviously as well, the relationship between me as an artist and the audience, me trying to get that message across to the audience, and hopefully them picking up on all of those things. I think for me, in terms of making connections, is that, you know, I was aware that for some people viewing the work, they would have prior knowledge of the original films, and so they would bring that to bear when viewing the work. You know, some people would view it through the filter of a historical context of, you know, there's this woman who's, you know, obviously white and her mammy and what have you. But there'd be another generation that wouldn't have that view necessarily. And so for me, it was a case of paring things back. So not making it clear as to the relationship between the two women, that it was mother and daughter. So every reference that the daughter makes to her mother, where she says, mother or mummy or what have you, that's all been removed. So, that kind of awareness that, you have an audience who will bring certain baggage to whatever they look at, and will come from, different perspectives, being kind of perspectives, I should say, being aware of that is quite important. And I want the audience to do some work. You can't have everything kind of laid out in front of them. So, if they see a piece of work where they have to make an effort, where everything isn't obvious, I think for me that would be far more interesting and intriguing. And it's a mechanism, a means of making people kind of stay with the work.
You've written about the idea of Susie Gablick's connective aesthetic, but that your work isn't necessarily coming from that particular angle. So what way do you relate to this idea of a connective aesthetic?
I think for me, I see it as kind of multi-layered, so within my work there'll be several strands. So for example, I'm thinking of one piece of work that I did, which was called 15 Words. And so you have a situation there where you've got the words, whereby people are confronted with words. I should explain, basically it's a series of photographs of myself holding up a placard with a word written on it. And each of the words are different. And also the clothes that I'm wearing are different. So at the same time, there are a series of words whereby it's clear to me anyway that, the audience being shown these words will try and think, what's the relationship between those words? But then also as well, perhaps look at the clothing that I'm wearing and think about, okay, so in this photograph of herself, she's got a jacket on, and in that photograph, she's got a jacket on. Is there some kind of connection there? In those photographs, she's wearing hats, different hats. Is there a connection there? So I suppose playing with the audience and playing with the idea of communication, because that's what art is. Art is another type of communication. So there's that kind of aspect there where you can kind of get across lots of different ideas in one hit through your work.
When you're making that work, were you thinking about any other artists' work? Were there any influences that you can think about that fed into the work?
I think at the time I was interested in seriality and the fact of having, a series of images, and what does that do to the viewer being confronted with almost the same image each time, but slightly different. How do you interpret that? Does it kind of reinforce something there?
In terms of the imitation work?
Well, once again, repetition is used. So there's, certain words, certain phrases that are reiterated each time, and reiterated but with different images. And so, how does that kind of interplay, affect the audience? If a particular phrase is shown with one image and then shown again with something else, do they interpret that differently? So. Okay, so for this work, it's a series of prints, and they're prints on black paper, and they are etchings, and the ink is predominantly black. So it's very hard to look at the images or to see what the images are. And the images are of Hollywood actresses during the kind of golden era of Hollywood. And so it's a series of prints of these kind of iconic actresses. The reason that I use the term courting the gaze is essentially because these actresses were chosen because of the way that they looked, because men would look at them, women would look at them, they were beautiful. And so the idea that the studios would have in terms of using these actresses or these beautiful women to groom as actresses were that this would translate to the movie screen, that people would go and see their movies and want to look at these amazing women. So there's that idea of, the gaze of the cinema viewer being courted, also in terms of the photographs, the gaze of, you know, the viewer looking at the photograph, being courted, not explaining it very well. Also, you know, I think as well, you know, the reason that with many of these prints that I chose, or these images that I chose, that the women are looking directly at the camera. And so that idea of that kind of confrontational gaze where they're looking back. So you're looking at them, they're looking at you.
Yeah. And how did that work come about? How did you sort of embark on this particular work?
So basically with the Look series, the reason that it came about was I was having a discussion with someone in their 20s, their early 20s, and I mentioned the actress Bette Davis, and they said, oh, that name sounds kind of familiar, but I don't think I've heard of them. And I think I mentioned, some silent movie actresses like Louise Brooks and Mary Pickford, and they hadn't heard of these actresses as well. And I know that if I'd mentioned Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, they would have known those actors. So it started me thinking about, you know, actors within Hollywood. You know, why is it that so many of the female actresses now, it seems, aren't as well known as the male actors? And that's how I decided upon making this work, as a way of kind of, what's the word I want to use? Not reinterrogating the past, but bringing the past into the present, kind of reassessing these images of these women. So that's initially how it kind of started. But then once I got into it, it also started making me think about the fact that, you know, many of these actresses during the golden age of Hollywood, I mean, you know, they would be the top draw, their films would be immensely popular, they would be the highest paid actors, and yet there was this kind of lack of control that they had. They were a commodity and they were easily disposable and interchangeable. And so, you know, there's this kind of image of them being, you know, so kind of big, iconic and powerful, and yet that wasn't the case. And then I think as well was this kind of aspect of beauty. You know, they're kind of this idealized version or image of what beauty is and what beauty should be. And it made me think of also as well of that kind of Western tradition of art and the nude and the depiction of women, the historical depiction of women, and how that was kind of analogous to what was happening in Hollywood as well. So there were all these kind of things at play with the work.
You've said that that your use of media often depends on what the subject
Yeah.
is. What could you explain a little bit about why you chose to do prints in this particular case around these actresses, and rather than say use film?
I think for me, having a series of prints, I think, you know, it was a case of I wanted these women's eyes to be looking at us, and for us as a viewer to think about them looking at us and us looking at them. And so the best way for me anyway to kind of get that across was to have a series of these prints and a series of these images to have that impact. And I think more so than trying to put across that idea in the form of film. I think, you know, that's, for me, it was far more effective. And also because of the nature of the prints, where it's very, you know, you have to work, you have to make an effort to actually see the images. There's that aspect as well. So that was why print kind of really lent itself to, I suppose, the outcomes of my research and my ideas.
It's a kind of ghostly sense of a trace.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because that's what it felt like. It felt like, you know, so many of these actresses who were so well known and so big in their day, it was like they were fading, but not quite faded through, not quite gone. They're kind of like in a semi-state of being there but not quite there, you know, half there, half known, half remembered. You know, someone look at the face and go, oh, that's quite familiar, isn't that such and such? And they'd get the name wrong. Oh, such and such, and once again, it's a different actress's name, it's not them. And it's happened more than once. It's happened on quite a few occasions where you can tell that, you know, people do a double take when they realise that it's me making the work, because it, you know, the work for the Look series, it does focus on white women. And, you know, and I'm sure that if I was making work that focused, say, on black males, there wouldn't be that kind of response. So it shows to me how sort of being black in their eyes kind of trumps being female. You know, for me, you know, making a piece of work, you know, and it focuses on women, that's just as normal as if I made a piece of work and it was focusing on the fact that I'm black. You know, it's equal to me, you know. But I think it's kind of interesting, that kind of response, that it's like, you know, well, why wouldn't I make a piece of work that focuses on women? Basically, Callas in Peckham was a documentation of performance that I did in Peckham Rye Common, where I was singing in an operatic style, and I was singing about certain aspects to do with living in Peckham. And essentially the work came about as a reaction, as a response to, for me anyway, for the art scene in Peckham. I just felt that the art scene in Peckham just didn't correlate to life in Peckham. It was just, it felt like a kind of, it's not even that it felt like, it is a bubble compared to, you know, life in Peckham, and it's like the two just never meet. And so I wanted to kind of create an art piece that kind of encapsulated aspects of that. I think it was the idea of mixing that concept of highbrow and lowbrow. And so, not that inner city life is necessarily lowbrow, but highbrow in the sense of fine art. And so, you know, opera is seen as very highbrow and, you know, pure art form as such. And so incorporating that aspect within the performance and contrast it with, you know, talking about issues that are happening in a inner city. I suppose for me, I mean, when it comes to performance, I like to take the audience by unawares. You know, I think a lot of time with performance, you have the audience and they're expectant. They know that, okay, a performance is about to happen, and there's this kind of expectation. I think it's far more interesting when you hit them with a performance and they don't even realise that a performance is necessarily happening. It's far more interesting. And so I've had situations where I've done performances and I've been heckled, which you know, I don't mind. You know, it just throws up these kind of interesting situations. And so for that reason, a lot of the time with the performances that I do myself, I don't have them documented, because once people see a camera there, then they know, okay, it's a performance, this should be happening. But if you spontaneously kind of hit them with something and there's no camera, and they just think, gosh, is she acting weird? Why is she doing that? Then, you know, it's far more interesting, I think, for them as well as for myself. It's a real challenge. I think, yes, there is an element of institutional critique. I think it's that aspect of, you know, an institution being in a bubble. You know, I think, you know, the art scene in Peckham, they love to kind of emphasise the fact that, hey, we're in Peckham. And it's kind of like, well, you could actually be anywhere, you know, so what that you're in Peckham? You know, do a lot of Peckhamites even know that you're there? You know, how does the fact that this scene is in Peckham impinge on the local people? It doesn't. And so yeah, so with that work, I feel there was that kind of element of kind of critiquing that whole kind of art institution, because the idea for me was to have that work being performed inside a gallery space in Peckham, you know, and how would that audience react to that, you know. Yeah, good question. I think I think for me the realization is that undoubtedly it is political, whether I want it to be or not. I think being black, being female, coming from an immigrant working class background, there's no way around it. And you know, it doesn't bother me. It is what it is. You know, I make the work. Yeah. You know, there's nothing wrong with the work being political. Oh gosh, there are so many. Where do I start? I think David Hammond's has to be one of them. His piece, well, there's two that really stick in my mind. One is Spade, so that print where basically it's shaped like a spade, and you've got, I think it's actually an image of himself. I remember seeing that, and I didn't know the title, and I thought, why is it shaped like a club? And then I read the title and I just laughed because, you know, he had turned that negative connotation of being black and being a spade right on its head in the fact that he created such a beautiful piece of work. And then also the other piece of his where it's the door, I think, is it Admissions? I can't remember the proper title, but you know, that was to do with college admissions for black students trying to get into university. And when I saw that piece of work, it really resonated for me because it was at a time when a lot of my friends, they had, you know, done their degrees, they had done MAs and what have you, and they were finding it so hard to get a job, far more so than their white counterparts. And I thought, you know, that had been done, you know, that piece of work had been done how many decades ago and it's still relevant now, you know, so David Hammond's definitely, yeah. Definitely Adrian Piper, for me, her work and her writing as well, it's just really amazing. Actually, what I should have said when I was talking about Imitation 3459 was that I know that her essay, Passing for White, Passing for Black, that was something that I was reading at the time. And that did kind of, I know that was kind of dwelling in my head when I actually made that piece of work, because I was actually thinking about, you know, is, you know, the idea of passing for white, is that still kind of relevant? Is that still important? You know, is that still such an issue? And so you know, that piece of writing was definitely there in my mind with that work.
Tell me a little bit about
Yeah.
the idea of appropriation and how
Yep.
you've used appropriation in some respects in your work.
I think for me, appropriation, for me, I see it as a very rich medium to be used. And then for me, it's a way of, you know, the present is formed by the past, and the future is you know, its foundation is the past as well. So, you know, using resources from the past, that's just a way of linking it to the present or having an understanding of what's happening in the present. So it's, you know, it's a way of mining history and making us reassess history, because history is something it's not stagnant. It's something that's being, you know, reassessed, reformulated, rethought, regurgitated all the time. It's in constant flux, and our understanding of history is constantly changing. And so using appropriation, it just makes sense in helping to understand our present. You know, it's a means of understanding our present. Okay, so I came across the term post-black approximately about 2 years ago. And it was through two different avenues. One was through my interest in work of Glenn Ligon, or Ligon. And also because I was looking at Studio Museum Harlem. And so I had come across Thelma Golden. And so, you know, I had come across this kind of conversation they were having about post-Black. So.
And what did you understand by this term? Or what do you understand by this term?
Well, that's the thing. I didn't understand it. I mean, one of the first things that I did was I Googled the term on Wiki to kind of try and get an understanding of what post-Black meant, because it didn't, for me, it didn't make sense. So I couldn't get my head around what this term was trying to reference. And maybe because it's the, you know, the use of the word post. For me, like post means afterwards, after the fact. So after Black, you know, what do you have after Black? You know, if you've had Black, I just couldn't kind of understand. I think it was the label and what it was trying to define. I'm not sure about how the idea of post-Black resonates with my work. And I suppose the best way for me to kind of answer that is to talk in terms of actually feminism and post-feminism. If I think of, you know, the fact that, you know, as a female artist, I am free to make whatever kind of art that I want. I don't necessarily, or I don't feel compelled to necessarily make art that addresses the issue of, you know, my body and how my body is represented. There's that sense of freedom. And I suppose in that sense, if I think about post-Black, there is that kind of sense of freedom whereby, you know, I don't feel that I necessarily with my artwork all the time have to address issues to do with race and to do with the fact that I'm Black. I feel free to make other artwork. And so, for example, like the Look series, where I'm addressing the issues of women, and these women are white. So. I think the work of the art made in the 1980s by Black artists, it is relevant for me as an artist, because if it wasn't for those pioneers, I feel that I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing. And so I feel in a very kind of privileged, fortunate position, actually. And that there's a lot of, I feel that there's a lot of freedom that I have, you know, because like I said, you know, there isn't that expectation that I necessarily have to make work that's about me being Black and about the, you know, the struggles and the hardships that I face as a Black person. When it comes to the global and contemporary, I suppose it's something that I don't really think about. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the world seems so small, this kind of global aspect, you take it for granted, I feel anyway. You know, I mean, if I want to have a conversation with my cousins in America, you know, we can use Skype, it's no issue. I mean, you know, something happens, you know, halfway across the world, you find out about it instantaneously. So, and I think because of that, I mean, people think on a global scale anyway. You know, kids thinking about going to university, they're not just thinking about going to universities within Britain, they're thinking about going to university abroad, you know, in America, wherever, you know. So the whole world is, I feel anyway, or maybe from this position where I'm at, you know, it's kind of like opened up. So when you do feel about art, it's always within a global context. The great thing about internet is that it's just a whole wealth of knowledge and that immediacy that you have. So we're in the past where there'd be a certain film that you'd hear about. It's like, oh, how do I get hold of this film to watch it? You know, you can go on YouTube and see clips of the films. You know, sometimes you can see the film in its whole entirety. So that opens up a wealth of information. So people are far more informed about certain things than they were before. the books that you've been reading, what have you, that's been produced using, you know, the internet and resources that I found on the internet and the World Wide Web. So yeah, that definitely plays a part in how I do my research, how I make the work even. It's all part and parcel of it, yeah. That's really hard because I think for, you know, for a lot of my work, it's the way I make my work, it's a response to certain things. It's a response to being an artist in this particular environment and what have you. So it's really hard to kind of say that, oh, my work will go this way or go that way. And I think also because of the nature of my work, you know, it's very diverse. You know, I've got projects where I'm working with print. I've got projects where it's to do with performance and different aspects of performance. And then I've got projects where I'm working with film. So it's, I don't know. And I like that. I like the fact that I, you know, from project to project, I don't know where it's going to take me or how it's going to evolve. I like that fluidity and openness. I think, I mean, especially if I think about the series of The Look, I think it was, for me as well, it was investigating the gaze, but also with the fact that I was very adamant that I wanted images of women or Hollywood actresses where they're looking back at you, that concept also of disrupting the gaze. And so, you know, you're there looking at them, but you're aware of them looking back at you. And so that kind of disrupts that whole kind of voyeuristic aspect that you can have in regards of looking at something that's kind of, you know, beautiful and gives you, you know, visual pleasure. So there was that aspect of the work that I wanted to kind of examine with it. So
to complexify that kind of
relationship. Definitely. You know, because so often, you know, you're looking at images of women and that, you know, idea of the objectification of women and, you know, seeking, you know, getting, you know, pleasure from looking at something that's beautiful, kind of playing with that. And I suppose for me as well, you know, disruption is something that's a common theme within a lot of my work. You know, it comes up time and time again with, you know, my performances, my performance pieces, and with films that I make, like Imitation 3459. There's a kind of disruptive element with the fact that, you know, you're presented with visuals, but it's not continual visuals. You'll have a kind of blank screen, a black screen in between, and also the disruption between the visuals that you see and the different audio soundtracks. So that kind of disjointedness and still managing to get across communication through that. I do find that interesting.
Do you think that sense of disruption and miscommunication comes out of a particular cultural experience? If you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. So, yes, I do think that the concept of disruption and miscommunication does come out of a cultural experience. Yeah, I really do, because, you know, being female and being black, there's so many times when you are misunderstood by default, because, you know, people have their preconceived ideas, and that is a barrier. You know, they bring certain baggage to the conversation, and you're there, and there's this kind of mismatch. So in my art education, no, I was not encouraged to explore issues of identity within my art. I remember specifically, and it's really interesting, one tutor came to me and said, "Oh, you realise you don't have to do any of that black stuff." And when they said that to me, I didn't understand what they were talking about, because at the time I was painting canvases totally black. And I was kind of experimenting with form and shape and color, and and all these canvases were black. So when he said that, straight away I thought, oh, so what's wrong with these paintings that I'm doing? I didn't realize that he was talking about, you know, actually being black, and it was only afterwards that it dawned on me what they were saying. And I just thought, well, why would you even say that to me in the first place? You know, if I wanted to investigate that, why not? You know, why is that such a touchy area? And, you know, it came up once again later on in my course, whereby it was kind of said, oh, well, this is the kind of stuff that's been dealt with in the 1980s and 1990s. We've kind of dealt with that and moved on. And I thought, well, I'm not aware of that discourse that was happening in the 1980s. I wasn't around then to be involved in that conversation. So, you know, why is it that it's suddenly stopped? You know, why can't we, you know, in the present have this particular conversation and talk about these issues? I thought, you know, it just seemed really kind of bizarre to me. I mean, what would happen is that once in a rare moon, you know, one of these artists would be mentioned, very rarely. And, you know, whenever an artist is mentioned I've never heard of, I'd always go and look them up and I'd find out about them that way. Then as well, it's just been by chance, through word of mouth, talking to other people. Oh, have you heard about this particular artist, or do you know about this person? You know, maybe an artist that you find interesting. I think a lot of it's just me, you know, off my own back, doing the research myself. That's how I've found out about a lot of the Black artists that I do know about. And that's, you know, stuff that I've done in the past and an ongoing thing as well. My opinion of the role of curators. Funny enough, I don't really have one. I suppose because in the sense that, you know, my experience when it's come to kind of like curating has been that, you know, I've had to curate things myself or with a group of friends, and so haven't really had that kind of interaction with curators. I feel it feels kind of bizarre though, because I know that, you know, anytime I do or have to interact with curators, you have to pass your work on to them, and there's this kind of relinquishing of control. And I think that's kind of hard for any artist, because, you know, you make the piece of work, you have total control over it. And so that's the aspect of interacting with curators that I find kind of tricky, because, you know, you relinquish that control to them and then they decide how your work then gets displayed. Okay, we're going to put it on this monitor, and you're thinking, no, it needs to be projected. What are you talking about? There's that kind of frisson.